Welcome, everybody. Thank you for your patience. This is Deep Dive, and I'm Gary, the producer with Danny. Danny has a last-minute meeting that he absolutely had to attend, and we thought this was too important to not bring it to you anyway. So here we are. Welcome. Maybe you recognize the gentleman with me. This is Steve Jermy. He is the British UK Commodore, and I want him to tell him a little bit more about himself. He's only been on a couple of times. So, Steve, welcome to the show. Just tell the audience who you are and where you came from.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back, Gary, and good to be working with you. Let's hope. I'm hoping that we're going to hear positive things from Danny. Let's just keep our fingers crossed. Be great if it's a special meeting for something special. That'd be terrific. But anyway, I'm ex-Royal Navy. Gary, I was started my life as a naval aviator in the Falklands War, flying from HMS Invincible. Later on, went to command ships. I commanded 4 ships in total, but that included deployments to both the Bosnia conflict and the Kosovo conflict, and then finished off as a 1-star. That's a sort of brigadier general equivalent. And at that stage, my work included working for the Chief of Defence Staff as his executive assistant, and also a final appointment to Afghanistan, where I was the strategy director in the British Embassy. I wrote a book called Strategy for Action, Using Force Wisely in the 21st Century, largely speaking because I realized that we in the West are not very good at strategy. Unfortunately, even though the book was published in 2011, we're not much better.
Huh. Steve, you say 4 ships you commanded. How many men was that?
Well, the first ship was a small ship. The next was a minesweeper. That's about 35 men. The third was a frigate. That's about 190, and then a destroyer, which is about probably about 280 in the destroyer. But we also had a full squadron, so the squadron was 6 destroyers.
And where were you on those ships?
I was captain in each of them, and we deployed to a range of areas. So, for example, in the last one, which is HMS Cardiff, I deployed to the Mediterranean, where I was part of standing NATO force Mediterranean, which was a Mediterranean force of 7 NATO ships, and that included deployments in not only the Mediterranean but also in the Baltic.
Nice. Wow. It sounds impressive. It might not be impressive to you, but it does to me, and I think to our audience, it's impressive. Steve, how did Friday play out in your mind when you saw that happen in the Oval Office? What was your impression, and what's your, now that you've had a couple of days to digest it? How are you perceiving it all?
My impression was that Donald Trump was right when he said that it would make good television, because it certainly did. I mean, it was shocking. But I also thought it was very interesting. What was very interesting was the reaction, which there's almost a polar distinction between the reactions of those mostly in America who were very felt that Trump was standing up for and Biden was standing up against Zelensky, who was continuing to actually make, I think I've heard somebody say Ukraine-splaining. I think that was Rubio saying that he's Ukraine-splaining. It might have been one of the other members. Whereas in Europe, it was very much, it was seen as an ambush of Zelensky by Vance and Trump, which, listening to the whole thing, and I think it's so important that people listen to the whole thing, the full 40 minutes. It didn't come like that across at all. Very, very different if you listen to the whole thing. And I think it's
right,
just
curious that you didn't buy that. You didn't think it was an ambush, right?
No, it didn't look like an ambush at all. It looked to me as if the critical moment was when Vance was explaining something which was to do with the Biden administration's lack of diplomacy. And Zelensky made the very silly decision to actually pick up on diplomacy and challenge Vance. And that's where it all started to go wrong. So I didn't get any sense that there was a trap there. Couldn't see it at all. But I think that some of the things that Zelensky then went on to do were very ill-judged. And it sort of in a way revealed his character, and character in leaders is so important, and I'm just not sure that anything that came across gave me a sense that this is a man with a strategic brain or the capacity to lead his country strategically.
You know, if that, even if it was an ambush, that would have been some kind of risk to take, to anticipate that Zelensky would end up being as arrogant as he ended up being.
Mm, mm. I think you're right. I mean, even if it was an ambush, then somebody who was quick on his feet would have been much more would have rolled with the punches and accepted it in a sort of gracious way, rather than trying to make a fight with the most powerful man in the world, arguably, and his number two. I mean, that's not a fight that anybody would want to take, and very ill judged so to do. I think, though, in a way, when Trump said that it was good that that the American people saw that, I agree with him. I think it was good. I think it was actually very revealing,
I
and I'm
agree.
just slightly surprised that the view was quite different on this side of the Atlantic. But there we are.
I think it's important that we all saw that.
Yeah, yeah,
We can hear all the stories, when they go in their back rooms and they do what they do, and then they come out and they tell us what happened, which that history
yeah,
has worked like that, and all of a sudden history gets flipped on its back or upside down, whatever, and we actually got in, uh,
yeah.
to see how the sausage was being made.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it, I suspect, I don't know, and we'll never know unless you have deep, intimate relationships with Vance, Trump, or Zelensky, of which I will never have any. But I thought that part of it was that Zelensky's been used to being the hero. He's been used to going around European and American capitals and coming away with all the support that he needs, make his case, and without really ever having been pushed back on. And now he's suddenly in a situation where he is being pushed back on, and at a time when he critically needs American support if he's going to keep going.
Yeah, I wonder how much Zelensky was really thrown off his game
Mhm.
there because, as you're talking about the support, I mean, he was just getting standing ovations no less than 2 weeks ago
Yeah,
by by the international community. So to go from standing ovations
yeah,
to getting a slap down, well, a slap down, that's an understatement, but to that in the White House, that's quite a juxtaposition from where he
yeah.
was.
What was also very interesting was hearing Marco Rubio actually talking about the much broader context and about how difficult it had been to deal with the Ukrainians, how Zelensky had insisted that he come to Washington.
Yeah.
And so that when you listen to that broader context, you could see that this wasn't just about a stand up fight. There was previous, I mean, there was, for example, the Treasury Secretary going out there and clearly having a very difficult discussion with Zelensky. So I think that when you look at the history, I certainly fall with those who think that this wasn't an ambush, but rather was an ill-judged approach by Zelensky in a very situation where he had almost no power.
I wasn't going to do this, but you've mentioned him a couple of times, so I think we should let's resort to what he's been saying. The Secretary of State Marco Rubio just yesterday, he made a couple of rounds on the Sunday shows. Let me just play you this first clip
Yeah.
here by Marco. I shouldn't say Secretary of State.
What
Yes.
are the Russians' demands? Under what conditions would the Russians be willing to stop this war? And as I said, we don't know what those are because we haven't talked to them in 3 years. That's the singular goal here, is to try to bring about an end to this conflict, and it begins by getting them to the table.
It's a simple point.
Mm. It's
It's a simple bullseye.
mm.
Get him to the table.
Yeah, it's such a simple point, isn't it? When Danny asked me last time round, he said, "What does Putin want?" My response was, "He wants somebody to talk to. You can't. This is not going to happen, or there's going to be no end to the war unless there is a diplomatic engagement." So, I could not agree more with the Secretary of State. I think a very interesting thing as well, which not many people seem to have picked up, is that there has been a very distinctive change in something the Secretary of State's been saying with this new administration. What he's been talking about is not an American hegemony. He's been talking about great powers, and that to me tells us that we're now in an administration in America who are no longer seeking to pursue hegemony over the rest of the world, but rather see their situation as much more balanced. I think that's a very positive thing, because I think this pursuit of hegemony by the Biden administration and indeed previous American administrations has not been good for America, nor indeed has it been good for the world. So I think that's a very positive change.
Positive is yeah, that's another understatement. It's what a when you look back on the last 4 years and the committed resistance to diplomacy is I think it's going to be a black mark on our meaning America's
Yeah.
many things, on our character, on who we say we are, and then we act like that.
Yeah.
It's
It's not just it's not just America, Gary. It's exactly the same here in Europe. I mean, there's a sort of it's almost. I was talking to both Ian Proud and Ian Puddock about this, and it's almost a cult where people accept and believe in the political narrative that Putin is an evil person, that Russia is part of the axis of evil, that it's an autocratic state with no elections, nothing other than Putin in charge. And it's so much more sophisticated and complex than that. I'm not saying that Russia's a perfect place, but blimey, neither is America, neither is Britain, neither is France, neither is Germany. And neither are some of the countries in the Middle East that we count as allies, but who are also much more autocratic, I would say, than Russia. I won't name names, but you don't have to look far around the Middle East to see a lot of very autocratic, non-diplomatic, non-democratic countries with whom we side with routinely without a moment's hesitation. And it would be hypocritical for us to, on the one hand, say that a particular Middle Eastern country is our ally, yet it's an autocratic, non-diplomatic state, and yet blame Russia, on the other hand, for what we say is both of those things.
Well, since all this is unfolding, there is somebody that thinks they have the answer to how to move forward here, and I think you might know this gentleman, not personally, but you're aware of him.
We will keep the military aid flowing and keep increasing the economic pressure on Russia to strengthen Ukraine now. We agreed that any lasting peace must ensure Ukraine's sovereignty and security, and Ukraine must be at the table. In the event of a peace deal, we will keep boosting Ukraine's own defensive capabilities to deter any future invasion. The UK is prepared to back this, with boots on the ground and planes in the air. Together with others, Europe must do the heavy lifting. But to support peace in our continent and to succeed, this effort must have strong US backing.
Well, those are some bold words.
Yeah. I think, as you and Danny know, I'm not in a position where I could or would wish to comment on specifically on British government policy for contractual reasons. But what I can do is talk about each of those things, Gary, from a European perspective, because clearly the elements that were laid out in front of us were as a result of a long discussion between 17 European leaders and Ukraine. And if we take them individually, I think military aid and economic pressure was the first one. I think with military aid, I think we've got to think this through. I think the Russians won't worry too much about defensive military aid and air defense missiles and those sorts of things. But I think providing additional aggressive military aid such as Storm Shadows, ATACMS, and those sorts of things which allow attacks into Russia was something I'd be extremely cautious about, because I think that what's clear is that with the American backstop looking increasingly less likely, it would be a very brave person to launch European built missiles deep into Russia and expect the Americans to back them up if Russia decides to respond to one or other of the nations that would be doing that. On economic sanctions, I think, of course, we can try and turn the screw on that. But frankly, the economic sanctions have done more damage to Europe than they have to Russia. So do we want to do more damage to the European continent? At the moment, we've got gas prices which are 3 times as much as they were before the conflict. And it's killing European industry, and particularly in Germany, which is the beating heart of the European economy.
You think that they would recognize that at this point in time? I mean, Steve, you're just saying that, from your perspective, you see that my gosh, they're looking at the spreadsheets. They know what's going on.
Yeah.
How could they possibly just be oblivious to those facts?
I think it's this issue, Gary, which is that Europe and the West, until the Trump administration arrived, have been acting according to a political narrative, whereas Russia has been acting according to a military strategy. And the political narrative is one which I think has come almost so ingrained within the European and now less so the American nations that they actually believe it. So I looked at the newspapers this morning, and there's almost universal support for the approach that's being taken. And all notwithstanding the fact that it seems to me to actually go completely counter to the facts on the ground. So I think one just has to accept this. I think as well, this is a slightly more subtle point, Gary, but I think in part this is because the way that the Western political establishments operate with spin. So we've got spin doctors. I'm sure you have got spin doctors. And the spin becomes so important that they sort of lose sight of the actual realities on the ground. So yeah, I think it's difficult to understand. I mean, sooner or later we'll get there, because actually, as the Russian steamroller marches on, and it becomes increasingly clear that that actually the spin that Russia's about to fall apart, and that the Russian economy is about to fall apart, isn't true, then the narrative will collapse. I mean, on the second of the issues, Gary, it was lasting peace and sovereignty. Now, I think that's, in a way, that is code for sovereignty, meaning that they would expect the Ukrainians to recover all of those things that Ukraine would say is sovereign territory. I'm sorry, but it's not. That can't be a part of a solution, because the Russians have been absolutely clear that it won't be. And the issue here is the balance of power, because the critical point is that even had America been on board with NATO, America and NATO nations together could not impose militarily on Russia a ceasefire, which or the conditions that they're seeking. So, in other words, notwithstanding that Ukraine may want to join NATO, and Ukraine may want the territories that they believe are theirs back, there isn't the military power to do it. So it doesn't matter how much we seek those military conditions, it won't happen. And so I think one has to be accepting of the realities on the ground, and that might be difficult, but there isn't the military power to make it any different.
Right. Well, I don't think at least in Poland, they're not ready to recognize those realities. Just this morning, or today, I should say, the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk had this to say, and I want to stop it as we go along here. So, give me a second. Let me go back. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's a paradox. He says somebody's already overlooked it. Now, listen to this math that he uses, Steve. It's going to come up. You'll see it. Yeah. So let me stop it here. So 500. I'll let it run. So 500 Europeans are asking 300 million Americans defend against 140 million Russians. So this is the math that he's resorting to. This is the rationale that he's using. That's what's at stake here. Yeah. It seems like a simple request, Steve. What do you think?
Well, he's got a point. I mean, bear in mind that Tusk has form. He's ex-European Union. So, but he's got an absolute point. The problem, though, is that Europe, Poland is one of the exceptions to this, which has invested in its armed forces, but most of the rest of the NATO nations have not. So, although that might be 500 Europeans, in terms of the investment in deployable and a credible armed force, by far the most credible armed force in the NATO nation, by far, is the American forces. However, it's clear that the Americans are now seeing Europe as best at fifth in their priority order and keen to extract. And I can't say that I particularly blame them. Not least of all because I don't believe that Putin does want to take the rest of Europe. I think it's the last thing he wants to do. It would be, as John Mearsheimer describes as brilliantly, about taking even the Ukrainian part of Ukraine as swallowing a porcupine. And it would be about swallowing 15 or 17 different porcupines.
Porcupine, I like that. I never heard that before.
NATO,
I'm sorry.
So, no, I agree with him.
Yeah, that's quite a way to propose it. And then one other point that he makes here is that, let me see if oh yeah, right, Europe. If there is something we lack today, it is not economic or demographic power, but the belief that we are truly a global force. Can they call themselves a global force without America?
No, but let's actually, because I think that's what he's trying to do. But I think let's put America to one side, because actually, what is the basis of global force? And this is the only thing which I would have a slightly different opinion to John Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer talks about the global power, if you like, or a great nation's power is based on two things. The first is the size of its population, and the second is its economic wealth. I think that's part of it, but I think two other things are equally important. The first is that it's industrial power, because you need industrial power to actually allow you to produce the military forces to do whatever it is that you want to do. And the second is it's energy independence, because frankly, without oil or gas, the military power is nothing. It's very interesting if you think back to the Second World War. The three great powers in that, on the Allied side, were Russia, America, and Britain to a lesser extent. And each of those had significant industrial capabilities in those times, as well as significant energy resources. So that, in part, was why I think that we prevailed. The Germans were always short of oil and gas, and the Japanese the Japanese Navy was killed, and the Japanese armed forces were killed very much by the American submarine campaign against their oil and gas reserves. So without those, there is no military power. And Europe doesn't have the industrial capacity, because much of that, not all of it, but much of it has been offshored in a sort of a process of deindustrialization. And we're now critically dependent on energy, particularly oil and gas, from other nations, particularly the Gulf. It was the Gulf states, of course. It was Russia, of course, and now American LNG. So I don't think that Europe now has the capability. It certainly doesn't have at the moment the capability to be a great power, possibly in the future, although it's quite a difficult ask, because you've got to reindustrialize and find secure sources of energy.
It's a long haul from now, though, right?
Yeah.
Let's come to over to America, and let's hear what they're saying. Here is National Security Advisor Michael Walsh this morning talking about what he thinks, or what their administration thinks, is success.
Success looks like President Zelensky sitting down and talking the terms of peace, talking about what he needs to see, Ukraine needs to see, to get to a partial ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, and an end to this war. And what became so evident to us in that session was he's not ready to talk peace at all. But here's the problem. Time is not on his side. Time is not on the side of just forever continuing this conflict. What we're hearing in terms of alternatives, whether it's the Democrats or leaders around the world, is essentially continuing this grinding World War I style trench warfare that is a meat grinder of people, munitions, and national treasure.
Steve, this administration, the Trump administration, is so fervent and so unrelenting and saying that any alternative that they have heard and are hearing isn't acceptable.
Yeah. Are you a Top Gun fan, Gary?
What fan?
A fan of Top Gun. You may not be.
Top Gun. Oh, yeah, yeah, sure. Look at the
I'm
movies, yeah.
Yeah, I'm
It's
a naval aviator.
It's a little bit over the top, but they're sure entertaining.
Yeah. No, I'm a naval aviator and a carrier aviator, and I love it as a movie. It's a fantastic movie.
Yeah.
There's a line in it. You may know it better than me, but I could use it to describe Zelensky, I think, one of the senior guys says to maverick. He said, "Your ego's right. Your ego's writing checks that your something can't cash." I can't remember what the
Oh,
something
that's
is,
excellent.
but
I remember.
he's expecting us to. He's expecting the West to deliver a settlement which we are unable so to do. We can't impose the conditions on Russia. We couldn't have imposed them even if America was on board, but America is now not on board. So we've got to go with the best deal that can be delivered. And I said in the last discussion with Danny, that I thought, and this is before the fracas in the White House in the Oval Room. I said that I thought that the most likely circumstance or the most likely path would be that the Americans and the Russians, as the two great powers and two realist powers now, both on the same page now, would work out the best deal that they could, and that the Americans would do the best that they could with limited cards. And then they would then offer that to Zelensky and the Europeans and say, this is the best that we can do. And if you don't like it, we're walking away. And Trump said exactly that. So I like to think that I might have got that one right, because I think the Americans will walk away. And who would blame them? Who would blame them? I wouldn't blame them if the Americans walk away. And then if they want to leave it to the Europeans, then I think it would be extremely difficult, because the Europeans without American backstops, what we'll end up doing, Gary, is that we'll end up with even worse conditions than we've currently got. So I think in that circumstance, then I think the next thing that will happen is that the Russians will cross the Dnipro and they will decide to actually take Odessa and cut off Ukraine from the sea. I would. There's a chance for now if we're prepared to be more diplomatic in our discussions, but if not, then they'll keep going.
Trump more than once threatened to walk away.
Yeah.
Right after the meeting and the following day, he said, "Listen, go ahead, you go make a deal." He said, "It's in your hands. You think you can make a better deal? Go right ahead."
Absolutely. I mean, I think the third of the conditions in the plan was interesting, because it was really talking about putting Ukraine in a position where it will be able to deter future Russian attack. But that's really code for remilitarization. So it's code for rebuilding the Ukrainian armed forces. And again, this will be a complete non-starter with any Russian negotiation. So I think that although I can understand why one might want to do that, the chances of the Russians accepting that are at best around about zero. So I think that I've come to the strong view that actually the best security guarantee that Ukraine can be offered, and bear in mind that America would struggle to offer Ukraine meaningful security guarantees that could be backed up with deployable military power, and even less so the Europeans. The best security guarantee that Ukraine could secure would be through neutrality. And through neutrality on either the Austrian or the Switzerland model, then I think that would be by far the best way to achieve the security that they're looking for.
Wasn't the mineral deal basically? I don't know if that would be fair to use that same terminology, but like a demilitarized zone, basically, because you're going to have American, not boots, but Americans on the ground there working the land, therefore ensuring that Putin is, going to act upon that. So, wasn't that what was on the table?
I'm not. It was. I'm 99% certain part of the Istanbul Accords. So part of the Istanbul Accords. I don't think I'm not sure whether they expressly used the term neutrality, but it was an effective neutrality, right. And that was all but accepted by Zelensky until they were persuaded to accept foolishly the direction of Biden and Boris Johnson. So it was there in the past. And so, again, it seems to me to be by far the best thing in the future. I mean, if there are boots on the ground, they won't be boots of NATO peacekeepers. There's absolutely a non-starter. But I think there's a very different approach, which might be observers. So instead of those soldiers from NATO nations, especially those who've been explicitly supporting Ukraine. That will be a non-starter for Russia. It's a very different story if we start to talk, though, about observers from the OSCE who are there to make sure that there is no remilitarization on either side of the contact line. So, in other words, that ideally, rather than building up military forces, you would like to think that and the start of a ceasefire, we could start slowly to back off and demobilize some of those forces as part of a sort of confidence and security building measures.
Right. Walsh went on to say why Zelensky is so problematic.
What we don't have right now is President Zelensky saying, I am ready to take the steps necessary and have the conversations necessary and make the compromises necessary to end the fighting, go to a ceasefire, some permutation of there's 1 month, there's 2 weeks, there's stopping long-range strikes on both sides, on each other's energy infrastructure. All of those things are on the table, but they were on the table before last Friday as well. And what we essentially heard was he's not ready to talk about it as though grinding this war forward for the years to come is truly an option, and it's not.
Steve, do you think that Zelensky lasts? Is he going to stay in the picture?
I think that's a very good open question. I think Doug McGregor was very interesting on this, and could I imagine Zelensky being out of the picture in a very sort of disastrous way for Zelensky? I could imagine that. I could imagine it in the worst case. I could imagine, and this would be very difficult for the West. Actually, I could imagine the extremists, the Azov Brigade types, taking him out. But what I think would be much better would be a graceful step back from it, and instead a caretaker president. And the person who, for many people, springs to mind is Zelenskyy, who's currently a well-respected general who's currently in the ambassador in Britain. Because what you want here is somebody who's pragmatic and understands the realities on the ground and is not prepared to fight on, like, as you know, we had this. It's sad, but sadly amusing. The sort of fight on like the knight in the hunt for the Holy Grail, as more and more of his arms are cut off, which is this. It's amusing in one way, but of course, what Zelensky is actually doing by refusing to accept that he cannot have conditions met that are impossible to impose on Russia. More and more Ukrainian soldiers are being killed. And it goes on and on and on. And I hear a lot of the British press are talking about the huge numbers of Russian soldiers who are killed. But when you look at the sources of those numbers, they're almost all of them coming from Ukrainian sources. So, of course, it's in their interest to actually make it look as if they're winning. But I keep saying this. I mean, if this is the case, then how come the Ukrainians are desperate for ammunition, whereas the Russians are outproducing the whole of Europe and America? Ammunition is the major killer in this sort of war, and I cannot match up huge Russian casualties at the same time as Ukraine being short of ammunition. It makes no military sense whatsoever.
Our new Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, pulls back a little bit further than Zelensky. She doesn't address him directly, but looks at the bigger picture here.
I think those who are criticizing his efforts are showing that they are not committed to peace. And in the case of many of those European countries, that they're not committed to the cause and values of freedom. Even though they speak of this, we heard very clearly during Vice President Vance's speech in Munich different examples of how these European partners and longtime allies in many cases are actually implementing policies that undermine democracy, that shows that they don't actually believe in the voices of the people being heard, and implementing anti-freedom policies. We're seeing this in the United Kingdom. We're seeing this in Germany. We saw it with the tossing out of the elections in Romania. So there's something fundamentally deeper here that shows a huge difference in divergence between the values that President Trump and Vice President Vance are fighting for. Basically, that they are going to support him in continuing this war, and that they don't stand with us around these fundamental values of freedom.
Steve, there is such a huge gap between the Trump administration, what he's trying to accomplish, and well, the European Union and so many others, that is them, and that gap isn't going to be anywhere near as closed by the current, the 4 steps that we just heard Starmer laying out to begin with. They might as well be, they're on different ball fields. You can, there's no meeting of the minds there at all.
Yeah, I think the issue here, though, is that again, I'm repeating a point I made in a previous, it might have been one back, Gary, which was that there may be a gap between, on the one hand, America, and on the other hand, the Europeans and Ukraine. But the only entity, only one of those 3 entities with any power over Russia or ability to influence Russia is America. So, like it or not, for the Europeans, unless they want to pick up the ball, the baton of trying to impose the conditions they want on Russia, they would be best to listen to America and work with America and deliver the best conditions that can be done in very difficult circumstances. That might not be easier for Europeans to have, but it's either that or what they'll be doing is extending the war and extending the killing of Ukrainian and Russian troops.
Starmer, even in his own words, said in the first clip that we played in the very beginning of the show, said, we need America to be involved in this. So you've got this great plan, but you can't pull it off by yourselves. And the Trump administration has no interest in signing on to this.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why the Europeans would feel like that. I can understand why they would want America in this. But actually, you've got to look at what America has said. And you've got to understand that in the very first instance, America will look after its own national security interests. Of course it will. So America's not going to prejudice its own national security interests because of what Europeans want. I mean, there's a whole load of history for that, but you've got to come at this from the perspective of what are in America's national security interests. Under this administration, they see in America's national security interest the extraction from a war which they think has no future. The extraction, I think, as well from Europe, or at least the reduction in the size of their commitment to Europe, because after all, there are 500 million people here and 300 million in America, but also because they think they have more important fish to fry. There is the issue of America's own homeland security, which is top. There is the issue of the Middle East, which is a ticking time bomb and much more important strategically for the world. There is the issue of China. And last but by no means least, there is the issue of the Americas. And so America's sphere of influence has been throughout. They've been the regional hegemon. And of course, there are issues about how that plays out. So Europe's right down at the bottom of those. And I think Europeans need to accept that rather than trying to suck America back in when it is exactly against America's national security interests. The worst thing that the Europeans can do, and we saw this during the interview, is tell Americans think about how they feel. It's not a good idea, clearly, to tell Trump about how Americans should feel about having a big ocean between them. That wasn't a good thing to do. Right. And I think what Europeans shouldn't do as well is tell America what is in its own national security interests. It's for America to judge that, of course it is. And America's the powerful partner here. So it's about time that Europeans started to accept what Americans judge in their national security interests and work with that as opposed to try to fight it.
Yeah. And we still have, no matter what happens, at least at the moment, we're still dealing with this gentleman at the moment.
So the question today is, can Ukraine win this war or hold off Russia without continued U.S. support?
It will be difficult for us. That's why I'm here. That's why we speak about the future negotiations. It will be difficult without your support, but we can't lose our values, our people. We can't lose our freedom.
Steve, that so concerns me. Now, this was, I should have said, this was after the dust up, the rumble in the White House. So this was later that day that he commented like that.
Yeah.
He says, oh, going forward, if it's without America, if Donald Trump says, yep, okay, go Hugo, make your own deal.
Yeah.
He says, it'll be difficult,
Yeah.
but we have to win.
Yeah.
That's
No,
what
you're
we're
right.
dealing with.
No, you're right. As you say, the rumble in the oval jungle was what we saw, wasn't it? I'm afraid that it's to anybody who's got really decent military experience, but also is able to think strategically. It is obvious, and indeed was obvious as far back as 2022, that Ukraine was unlikely to win this war. So the idea that and that was with America on board, the idea that they can win the war without America on board, it's fantastical. It's clearly impossible. So what that shows you is that you've got to be so careful when you're in these sort of circumstances about picking your leaders. In the way that I look at this, for a leader to be competent, he has to have a very good understanding of the way to strategically deploy his armed forces. It's clear that Zelensky doesn't. It looks to me like he's been part of keeping the Kursk salient going and losing people on brigades upon brigades in that salient. It looks like he has been responsible for as far back as Mariupol and keeping the Mariupol operation going when it was clearly destined to fail. And I suspect that the reason that Zelensky left was because he was telling truth to power and telling Zelensky things that he didn't want to hear. What you have in Zelensky is a man who, by the criteria that I use, which is strategic success, is incompetent. It's not his fault in a way, because he's a comedian by training, with little political experience and no military experience. But in terms of competency, his track record, which includes probably over 1 million Ukrainians killed, tells me that this is not a competent leader, and at a time when they desperately need a competent leader. So no, I mean it's fantasy what he was saying.
And I think one of the most profound things about it is he's an incompetent leader, but yet the accolades and the cheering on that goes on around him. You can understand that he'd buy into that. He wants to believe it.
Yeah.
He kind of needs to, but he also wants to. So that what a deadly cocktail that is that he has, right?
I mean, I think the issue there, and this comes to a more subtle point in a way, Gary, is the issue of the judgment in the West's elites. Because the West's elites who have developed this narrative, the political narrative that is driving our operations, at least until the Trump administration arrived, the West narrative is that actually Zelensky is the great Chechenian hero, and Putin is the great Hitlerian villain. And when you look at it, it's so much more complex and sophisticated. But if you're buying into that narrative, then you get into the situation where Zelensky is, for example, feted by the Canadian Parliament, who actually included in his fating a German soldier who'd been part of the Waffen SS. That sort of extraordinary narrow vision, which has caused us to be in the circumstance we are. It's a tragedy. There's nothing else but a tragedy, because as so many people, the one I like most on this is John Mearsheimer, but as so many people have said, this was a wholly avoidable war. And, the amount of lives that have been lost, well in excess of 1 million, which is twice as many as the whole of the British Armed Forces and the Commonwealth forces lost in the Second World War, lost and squandered for poor thinking. There's a very famous French general. It's not why he's not famous, but he's famous to people like me who are interested in strategy. His name's Andre Beaufret. And what he says, in war, the loser deserves to lose because his defeat will be due to failures in thinking either before or during the war. Nothing could more explain why the West is in the situation it is. It's due to failures in thinking before and during the war. And it's because of those failures in thinking that we've lost. And it's about time we worked out how to stop failing in thinking as we have done up until now.
Oh, amen. Amen. Steve, I love talking to you, brother.
Yeah. No, the pleasure's mine. The pleasure's mine, Gary. It's almost like we're sort of in a bit of a cult society over here in Europe, and it's just nice to have people who sort of share the same views as us.
Steve, you are not in a cult, brother. You are not in a cult. Listen to me. Look me in the eyes.
Yeah, yes.
All right? You're not in a cult.
Yeah. No, we're the voices in the wilderness, and you're the people who help keep us sane.
Listen, you too. All right, brother. You carry on,
Yeah,
and we'll talk to you soon. All right.
Yeah, likewise, Gary. The pleasure's been mine.
Right,
Thank you again.
Good.
Bye.
And thank you all. So grateful for you coming here. We appreciate every one of you. We're grateful because of you guys we're able to do this. So as always, stay unintimidated, uncompromised, and we'll see you next time on Deep Dive.